So our topic tonight is the dynamic nature of the salt marsh. And I'm really excited to talk about this because as we were talking through this topic, we were saying that sometimes the salt marsh and the estuary and the ecosystems that ring it are really underappreciated. And when people want some nature that really seems to knock them off their feet, they think about mountains and trees that form a canopy over their head, and lots of colors and levels. And the salt marsh is low, and if you don't look carefully, it can look kind of monochromatic. And I grew up here, and when my mom would take us out to the Baylands, I always kind of felt like it was kind of smelly. But it's really just an amazing, amazing place. And so thanks for being here to join us in talking about it, because it's a productive. It's got all these special species that are adapted to live in what's really a pretty harsh environment. So it's a really special place. Hannah gave us the introduction to Grassroots Ecology. This is our Cooley Landing site, which is our bayside site that we do habitat restoration work. And we do mostly sort of upland transition zone sites at Cooley, but it's a great place to stop off the Bay Trail and see some great salt marsh habitat on either side. Okay, hold on. Okay. Salt marshes in general, this is a figure from a UN report on salt marshes globally, and less than 50% of the world's original wetlands remain. Coastal land is always in high demand. Lots of people live by the coast, and that land is really at a premium. So it's a ecosystem that we really need to be mindful of protecting as we move forward for many reasons that we'll get to. And it really is some of the most productive temperate ecosystem type in the world. So I think when people think of productivity, they tend to think of the forests, rainforests, northern forests, but really these salt marsh systems are extremely productive. Okay. That loss of wetland is true of the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe even more so than the figure we just talked about. Here in green, you can see around the San Francisco Bay, that large estuary, the historical extent of tidal marsh, and that was around 1800. And then you can see the current extent of what's tidal in bright green, and that means it's still, the salt marsh is still open to the natural flow of the tides and the flooding of the tides. And then there's restored baylands, which means there's some sort of tide gate. So it's a salt marsh, but it's not completely open to tidal influence. And then what's really cool about this particular figure is the dark green, which is the planned restoration and enhancement. Those are places that humans have actually helped to restore some of the salt marsh habitat, and Hope is going to talk some about that in her talk, because she's part of a very, very large effort in the South Bay, a huge restoration project. So just as some background to this estuary and this marsh, the San Francisco Bay is the second largest estuary in the United States. And humans have lived along and around this estuary since actually before it was an estuary. So the bay is actually relatively shallow, and it was once a valley. That valley filled in starting about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. So humans have been living here to witness that change for thousands of years, using the amazing productivity of the bay and the ecosystems around it. The marshes themselves actually didn't form until quite a bit later. As glaciers melted and the rivers dumped tons of fresh water and sea level rose, the rate of fill was actually so high that you can sort of imagine filling up a swimming pool. And it wasn't until about 6,000 years ago that the rate of sedimentation being brought by the rivers actually became the more dominant feature of the marsh, and became faster than sea level rise was happening. So one thing that we're going to talk about is that, marshes get built sort of at this dynamic interplay between sea level and the forces the forces of water, both the sea and the rivers, and the rate of sedimentation. And that's a really important feature of the marshes. So as those have been here now since about 6,000 years ago, and indigenous groups were living alongside those wetlands, using some of the enormous productivity with fishing and using the shellfish and the birds to make their life. And it wasn't until about 200 years ago, really, when land use changes started to really accelerate. And we had the gold rush, which really brought a land grab with it. And in the middle of the 1800s, around the same era, Congress passed something called the Swamplands Act, which essentially allowed private citizens and private landholders to drain marshland for what they called improvement, but really to turn it into agricultural land or some other kind of what they thought of as usable land. So that was when a lot of this sort of green boundary area around the bay became drained and diked and filled in. You look at a map of the bay, and people like their maps to have clear boundary lines. We don't really like the idea that where the land is might shift or be dynamic, but that's sort of how an estuary works, and it really is dynamic. And over a thousands of years period, it has been quite dynamic, and just the forces shaping this shoreline have really changed over time. As you can see in this particular picture, which I actually took at the recent king tide, the boundaries of our shoreline at the San Francisco Bay, they are not a clear line. The tides have both daily cycles, they have seasonal cycles, and they also have changes that are not cyclic, like the sea level rise that we're not going to talk a lot about today, but we will be talking about at a future talk. And all these forces of different sedimentation, water levels, and shoreline change are shaping this ecosystem as we go. And one of the things that has both changed the sedimentation rate here is, you can see this picture on the right here is a big operation. Actually, I wonder if anybody recognizes where that is. You can call it out if you recognize it. That's Treasure Island. So there's sort of like a natural island that you can see behind it, but then there's a giant flat area that has been filled in. And so essentially the bottom of the bay is sort of the sediments below are scraped up and then dumped onto sort of the rocks and the shoals to build out. And this area of San Francisco that you see here, this old map, what you see in green is the historic creeks and wetlands. I mean, that's in blue, is the creeks and the actual marshy areas. And what's in purple is area where those marshes have been drained and filled. And if you are familiar with sort of like the earthquake history of the area, those are areas that have a lot of earthquake damage because that fill doesn't act the same way as land sort of with bedrock underneath it. So marsh dynamics depend on sedimentation, which comes naturally from the rivers, but comes through other sources as well. There's lots of different things that affect rates of sedimentation. Freshwater input is really important, and we have definitely seen a huge modification of the way we use or the way we allow water to flow in California in the past 100 to 150 years. Most waterways that flow into the bay have been dammed, and the water has been diverted for people to use for agriculture and in urban areas. The ocean dynamics, of course, affect marshes as well, and big ocean events can cause increased erosion. And of course, human activity, we now sort of recognize, interplays all these other factors. So human activity is now having a influence on sea level rise, and the dams and the water projects that we rely on in our state has resulted in about 50% less fresh water going into the bay. And we actually have an interesting dynamic now that with all of the dams that we have on our rivers, we actually have a sediment starved marsh. And so if we can't figure out a way to replace some of that natural sediment flow as sea levels continue to rise, we're going to start losing marsh. And that's actually really well categorized. Like in Louisiana, that's something that they're dealing with. There's actually a lot of sediment replacement projects that are being piloted in that area. The gold rush, I feel like I never learned this aspect of the gold rush when I learned about the gold rush growing up. But, you know, this was not a golden era of environmental stewardship. You can see this miner using a hydraulic hose. They basically used water cannons to decimate sides of mountains, and all that, you know, rock, gravel, rubble, basically buried many creeks and streams in the Sierra Nevada, but also that sediment load traveled down to the bay and actually increased a lot of sediment in the bay at that time, as well as contaminants that it was carrying. This is just a map of water projects in San Francisco, sort of driving home that we've really altered the hydrology of the state in such a way that we'll have to be mindful of the ways that we restore both sediment flow, and there's lots of groups that do a lot of great advocacy work about freshwater inputs to the bay, because it definitely affects fish survival among other animals. So what is a salt marsh? We know that an estuary is sort of where ocean meets freshwater input, and the salt marsh is in this boundary zone, and it's one of 4 ecological communities in the estuary area, the other being open water and the mud flats where you often see birds, and the freshwater marshes that are more upland. And these boundaries, you know, despite our best efforts, they don't really like to be firm, and that actually is mostly a good thing. They're like giant sponges, and one of the benefits they provide for us is to act like a big sponge during both storm surges or flooding events. In the case of sea level rise, they really act as an amazing buffer between land and water. And it's really a tough environment to be, especially a plant. Hope's going to talk a little bit more about the wildlife. But if you're a plant in this area, you are submerged to, you're submerged, you're alternately submerged when the tide is high. And then when the tide goes out, you're covered in salty brine and really pretty hot. It can get pretty hot out at the Baylands in the summer. It's very sunny. There's no shade. So you're alternately submerged, and potentially as a plant, you don't really have any oxygen at your roots because you're underwater. So the plants that are here, they're actually not a huge number of them, which is actually what I like. I feel like if you're a sort of, I consider myself a very amateur botanist, you can actually really know the plants at the Baylands. There's not an overwhelming number, but then the actual number of individuals out there is very high, and that's why the productivity is so high. And the plants are really special, and you can't find them elsewhere. Again, the salt marsh really provides a ton of ecological services. I mentioned flood control. The plants that live out there filter the stormwater that runs through them as it percolates through the soil. They provide amazing habitat. I imagine there's some bird watchers among us. I can tell from the chat. You know, it provides amazing habitat for birds. It sequesters carbon, and of course, it's great for recreation. So the salt marsh has these zones, and they're not lines, but they're these overlapping zones. And if you can sort of get an eye for where they are, you can really get to know some of the charismatic and some of the most plentiful plants that are out there. So I've sort of made the zones into the cordgrass, which is closest to the water. So it's right above sort of the mudflat zone. Then there's like the pickleweed area, which overlaps with the jalmia, and then some of these upland species. So the cordgrass is the species that really gets the most inundation. And it is amazing. It's like the workhorse of the energy production in the salt marsh. It's really, really productive. The grass, it does photosynthesis through a special mechanism. It's C4 photosynthesis, so it's really a highly efficient photosynthesizer. It does have roots pretty much where there's not a lot of oxygen, So it actually has these air spaces that run from the stem down to the roots that allows it to shuttle oxygen from the stomata in the leaves, like the air holes in the leaves, all the way down to the roots. And it also has these glands to excrete excess salt. All the plants that live in this area really have to have a mechanism to deal with the salt because plants don't like salt. Most plants can't deal with it at all. So this one has salt glands. It's a huge energy and nutrient source for the marsh ecosystem in general. It has nitrogen fixing bacteria associated with its roots. So its tissues are actually quite protein rich. And actually most of the ways it contributes nutrients to the ecosystem is through sort of the detritus that it forms as it dies and sinks back and sort of forms a layer where algae can grow on it and decomposers can work on it. So a lot of the productivity almost happens like where you can't really see it beneath the surface, but it really is sort of a cornerstone of the productivity of the salt marsh system. It is in competition with a lot of invasive forms. So the native Spartina is Spartina foliosa. There are other invasives that are competing with it around the bay, and there's a good reading for that in resources that are at the end of this slide that will go out if you want to read more about it. I took this picture, it's a little hard to see, but the taller grasses are the cordgrass, and I took it because you can see that the other vegetation, which is really the pickleweed, is interspersed. There's kind of a channel in the middle. And it just makes the point, there's not like line zones. These plants are sort of intermixed as a community. I think my favorite are the plants at the middle elevation, which gets some inundation. And the main one is the pickleweed. And the pickleweed is this one that looks, no, you need to talk to Daddy. Sorry, there's a naked, freshly bathed child. Okay. The pickleweed is this succulent plant that has really no leaves. To me, right, this is a recent picture of pickleweed. It looks like crazed caterpillars on a stem. And it has this cool adaptation where it actually stores salt water within its tissues and it concentrates the salt in these red tips. And this season is when you see these red tips. And when there's too much salt, it drops the tip off. But what's amazing about this adaptation too, and especially if you remember like an introductory bio class where you might have talked about osmosis, the way that pickleweed stores this salty water in its tissues actually maintains the pressure to keep water flowing in, because it's actually really hard for plants in this marsh zone to get really fresh water flowing in when the water outside is so salty. It's hard for them not to lose water. So pickleweed has this cool osmotic balance adaptation going on. And they do make little flowers, although they mostly spread in this mat forming way through their rhizomes, but they do make seeds. And you can, take a little red piece off and eat it, and it does taste kind of like pickles, and it's very salty. The other plants that sort of intersperse in this zone are this fleshy jaumia. I don't even know if I'm saying that one right. I never know how to actually pronounce that one. It has really beautiful yellow flowers. It's in the aster family, sort of earlier in the season. It looks a little bit like pickleweed at first, but it doesn't really have the jointed stems of pickleweed. You can still see it's still green right now. It's another sort of succulent plant with really chubby leaves. And then probably my favorite thing to find out there is this salt marsh dodder, spelled D-O-D-D-E-R. It's a totally parasitic plant. It looks like these orange threads, and it puts these little things called haustoria in the stems of the pickleweed, and it can grow on a few of the other plants in that zone as well. And it lives off of the nutrients and the photosynthetic products of the pickleweed or the plant that it's growing on. And it actually, right now, it does have these white flowers that are really beautiful. It's just such an interesting plant. It's so strange, and I don't know, I always just find it really amazing that it exists. And then at the higher elevations, you start to get a little bit more diversity. And these upland plants provide really, really important habitat for the animals that have to go somewhere at high tide. I mean, at high tide, the pickleweed and the salt, the cordgrass is submerged, and animals like the harvest mouse have to have somewhere to go. And that's to these plants at the higher elevation. So I've got a picture of Baccharis, which is really at the higher elevation. But right up out of the pickleweed, you'll see saltgrass. And this, I took this picture specifically because the salt marsh you can actually see the salt crystals. So even these plants are enough, they have their roots enough in the salty water that they have to have a mechanism to excrete that water. So you can see the salt crystals here on the salt grass. And then this is alkali heath right now, which has these pretty pink flowers and which also excretes salt in its leaves. Same with one of the big salt bush here. And then somebody's favorite was the grindelia. So there's a grindelia. We're in, I think, a period of time when we can redefine how we value our marsh systems, our salt marsh and our shoreline ecosystems. So I'm gonna hand it off to Hope to talk about the awesome restoration happening at Don Edwards and all the things you can find out there.
My name is Hope Presley, and I work for the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society at the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which you can see in the background of this photo here. This is our Environmental Education Center, which is located in El Viso, or North San Jose, so just north of 237. So this is a spot where all of you can come and visit. Our trails are open even during this time. And so Don Edwards is a National Wildlife Refuge. This is a map of all of our refuge lands that are managed by us. And then there are also a few spots where we have like lease agreements where we manage the land, but maybe don't own the land itself. And so Don Edwards was established in 1972 by a group of local citizens that rallied together. They saw that, these marshes had disappeared over the years and that they needed to be saved. So there was a group of people that literally went knocking door to door, gathering support, and with the help of a local California congressman named Don Edwards, they were able to establish it officially as a National Wildlife Refuge. And so the National Wildlife Refuge system is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is in the Department of Interior. So we are a federal agency. We are in the same department as National Park Service. So they're a little bit more well-known, but they're like our sister agency. Don Edwards was the first and is now the largest urban National Wildlife Refuge. Normally, or historically, National Wildlife Refuges were mostly areas that were away from urban centers. We don't typically think of there being a lot of wildlife within our cities. And so this distinction has been really important for our refuge as it is managed. And to be considered an urban wildlife refuge, you have to be within 25 miles of a population of 250,000 or more. And clearly in the Bay Area, even back in 1972, we greatly surpassed that number. So this is a really important piece to our puzzle. We have two visitor contact stations. The first one being a visitor center located in Fremont, just south of the Dumbarton Bridge. And then our environmental education center, which I showed you on that first slide, which is in North San Jose. We have over 30,000 acres of protected land now, which has been accumulated over the past almost 50 years. We're located along the Pacific Flyway, So we have lots of migratory birds that stop at the refuge for varying amounts of time and for varying reasons. We protect over 15 different habitats, over 280 species of birds, and various mammals, reptiles, insects, as well as threatened and endangered species, which we'll learn about later. So we have a big role to play in the San Francisco Bay. And we also provide what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service considers the Big Six. So these are approved recreational opportunities for the public. So we have environmental education and interpretation programs, wildlife photography, wildlife observation, and then hunting and fishing. So this one normally surprises people. We do allow hunting and fishing on the refuge. And hunting is a really important part of our history. So the refuge system was actually started because of hunting. So the refuge system was started in 1903 by Teddy Roosevelt. And he was an avid hunter and conservationist, and him and a lot of other people noticed that bird populations were greatly declining. And so with him and the help of the rest of his group, they decided to establish what they called back then bird refuges, as well as regulations for hunting, because back then you could hunt all day, every day. There weren't really any regulations on it. And so they implemented that to help save the population of a variety of species. So at Don Edwards, hunting season is from the end of October to the end of January. And there's very specific species. It's all waterfowl hunting. So there's specific species as well as specific number of those species that the hunters are allowed to take each day. There's also specific days that hunting is allowed in specific areas. And so sometimes we will get calls from visitors. You might hear shots while you're out there, and it sounds a lot closer than it actually is because it's so flat out there and the sound travels so easily. So don't be alarmed if you are out there and hear hunting. But they're all hunting in specific areas separate from the public. And then we also allow fishing in specific areas. We do have a public fishing pier that is actually part of the old Dumbarton Bridge in Fremont at our headquarters site. And you can go fishing there. You don't need a license because it's a public pier. And then we have 2 or 3 other spots that you can fish from as well. All right, and then, so I work for the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. And so we are a nonprofit, but we're also a friends group to the refuge. And so that means that everything that we do is connected to the refuge and benefits the refuge in some way. We are managed by a board of directors. We were established in 1987, so we're just a little over 30 years old. And has been supporting the refuge financially since then. We also coordinate an interpretation program, which is the program that I coordinate, called Watershed Watchers, and it's funded by the Santa Clara Valley Urban Runoff Pollution Prevention Program. It's a big name, and part of the program's goal is to reduce urban runoff pollution. And so we'll learn a little bit more about that later. The society supports the refuge, not only financially, but also through education programs. We produce a quarterly newsletter that you can sign up for called Tide Rising, that highlights various projects that are going on at the refuge and across our complex, because we actually have 6 other refuges in the Bay Area. We provide support for staffing buildings, visitor center and education center on the weekends. Then we also have some nature stores. We're trying to get some online capacity. There's a few items that you can purchase online. And then we also apply for and obtain grants to continue that financial and program support. Okay, so to get back to marshes, marshes are incredibly important. Not only do they provide habitat for wildlife, but they also do a number of great things for us too. So they're high oxygen producers. They help us breathe clean air. They help with climate change mitigation through carbon storing. They filter water runoff, which recharges the groundwater. They're fisheries. So there's lots of different species of fish that use the marshes as their breeding and nesting grounds. And then they're also a buffer zone for storm and flood protection, which again, we'll learn about more in a little bit. And so as Kathleen talked about earlier, we've lost an amazing percentage of our marsh habitat. I see varying numbers. The highest one I've seen is 95% in the entire San Francisco Bay. And you can see that here in these two historical photos. And so the first one at the top is from 1899. And so again, as Kathleen had mentioned earlier, people or in maps, the bay is typically represented by these hard lines without the consideration that there is this transition zone in between the bay and the land. And so in this photo up top, you can really see all of this black area was the tidal marshes. And you can clearly see that outline of the bay. Of course, knowing that that outline is not as stark as it looks here, but it's there. That's the open water and then the marsh. And then down below in 1979, less than 100 years later, you can barely see the outline of the bay or the open water because so much of the marshes have been developed on. And so not only has that reduced habitat for wildlife, but it's also put our communities at risk that created all of this development. And so first we're going to start with the wildlife. And as you can see from this illustration, there is a great amount of biodiversity within our marshes. And this list here, there are all different kinds of birds that use the marsh. Again, fish that come in, use it as breeding and nesting grounds. Even mammals will go down into the marsh. You can see a raccoon here. We have gray foxes in the Bay Area that will go into the marsh. Of course, raccoons and skunks and possums will even go down there. And then our invertebrates, so you can see down here at the bottom, there's all kinds of snails and clams and crabs that really provide the base of the food chain for all of this wildlife up top. So they're incredibly important for wildlife. And so being at a national wildlife refuge, the primary type of animal that we protect are birds. And so we have a great number of birds at the refuge, and it changes throughout the year. Because again, we are along the Pacific Flyway. So no matter what time of year you come, you'll always be able to find some new birds. So these are some of our common shorebird species that you might see while you're out in the marsh. We have American avocets here, and these even change throughout the year too. This, with their orange head, this is their breeding plumage. So in the spring and summer, they have this nice like burnt orange color. And then in the fall and winter, that burnt orange actually goes away and their entire head turns to white. So they look a lot different right now than they do in this photo. We also have black-necked stilts that are in the marsh. And I chose this photo because if you look carefully, you might notice There are two little chicks here. They look like little dirty cotton balls running around on sticks when they're out in the marsh. Um, and so this was a good example of how some bird species will use the marsh in our area actually to nest. And then we have a snowy egret, and this is a great photo of him getting hit by a wave. But you can clearly see his yellow feet down there, which he will actually use during feeding. He'll use his feet to trick fish and think that they're worms. And then he'll also use his feet to disturb the mud and loosen up those mud creatures, the snails and clams, to eat those. And so he kind of looks like he's doing a little dance when he walks in the marsh. And then we also have some smaller shorebirds like our least sandpipers, western sandpipers. Hannah mentioned killdeer earlier. They're a smaller shorebird species. And so we have a great variety of the different sizes of shorebirds. And this helps to reduce competition because they're all eating the same things. They're all eating those mud creatures, but they're able to do so in different parts of the marsh. So just how Kathleen described, there's different zones of the marsh. The birds will actually use those different zones or even different depths of the water to spread out and find their food. And that's one of the components of a healthy habitat is actually space. So they have the ability to spread out and eat their food. And then we also have lots of different waterfowl species who also eat those mud creatures, but again, in different ways and in different parts of the marsh. So we have our northern shoveler, and this bird is called a shoveler because of the shape of their beak. And so you can see at the end here, it gets a little bit wider and it looks like a shovel. And then we have these beautiful, these are one of my favorite waterfowl species that are the green-winged teals. And they have this gorgeous bright green color on their wing and on their head. Then we have our ruddy ducks. These are actually a really small species of duck. So this picture isn't the greatest to compare against these other ducks, but the ruddy ducks are actually really tiny. They almost look like they've been squished together, especially with that tail that stands up almost straight. And they have this beautiful bright blue bill, which is also a seasonal trait. So their bill gets more blue as they get into breeding season. And then we have our classic mallards, of course. And this is a great photo because you can see that the brightly colored one, this is a male, and then the females are brown. And this is similar for these other species of ducks as well. They have, these are all three males, and then the females are more of a brown color, which allows them to hide in the marsh when they're nesting so that they can protect their nest. And then of course the males are flashy because they're trying to get the female's attention. Then we also have a variety of water bird species. Caspian terns, these are the largest tern species, at least in North America. And these will actually nest at the refuge. And then we have forester's terns. These ones are smaller. They're hunters. If you see them flying, they almost look like their head is straight down because they're looking into the water to try to see movement of fish. Then we have our white pelicans. These have an enormous wingspan. It's about 10 feet. And they are not divers like the brown pelicans that we see out on the coast. They like to sit in the water and actually scoop up their food. And they will work together, similar to dolphins, how they'll work together to actually surround a school of fish. And they get closer and closer together, and they'll all start eating the fish. And you can see that out at the refuge too. And then, of course, we have a variety of species of gulls. Okay. And then we also have threatened and endangered species that are birds as well as other types of animals. So the western snowy plover is a threatened species. It was listed in 1993, and it is protected at Don Edwards. We do have some nesting that happens in the marsh and more like along the levees, along the trails. They like that higher ground, and then they also like to be out in the mud flats as well. They're a very tiny bird. They're only about 3 or 4 inches long. And then these are our 2 endangered species. They're kind of our like mascots of the refuge. The first one is our California Ridgway's rail. Both of these are endemic to the San Francisco Bay. So they're found nowhere else in the world. There are other species of rail, but the Ridgway's rail is found in the San Francisco Bay. They're kind of shaped like a chicken. So they have a smaller head and a larger body. They're very elusive. They like to hide. They're not considered nocturnal, but they are definitely more active at dusk and dawn. And they also eat those mud creatures that we talked about before, the clams and snails. They are large enough that they could be eating fish as well. And then we have our salt marsh harvest mouse, or Salty for short. Salty is also endemic to the San Francisco Bay. He is very tiny. He's about the size of your thumb, plus a tail. You can see he has these big dark eyes and big rounded like cupped ears. And these are some nocturnal adaptations that Salty has. So he can hear predators coming, and he can also see pretty well in the dark. Salty's lifespan is only about 9 months on average, so it's very quick. And both of these birds, or both of these animals, are endangered, as well as the snowy plover is threatened because of habitat loss. And so, as we learned before, we've lost upwards of 95% of our salt marshes in the San Francisco Bay. So we can estimate that we've probably lost about up to 95% of both of these species as well. And so part of what we do at the refuge in order to protect habitat as well as enhance the habitat is this restoration project. So this is the largest restoration project on the West Coast. It's called the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And part of the habitat loss that we talked about was not only development of cities and streets and homes, but it was actually the development of salt ponds. And these salt ponds were used to produce salt, some of which is a small amount, is salt that you might eat yourself, but the majority of it is used for industrial purposes. And so you can see in this photo, this is a satellite image. There's a mix of these like blue, green ponds, and then up here, this is Newark area. These are all red, orange, yellow colored ponds. And so these red ones are all currently in the salt production process. And then the rest of these ponds have been sold to Fish and Wildlife Service, California Fish and Wildlife, and maybe a city or two also owns some. And so these ponds were built by constructing levees or walls around Marsh. And then that area was flooded with water, which drove out the wildlife and then drowned the plants that were there. And so over time, the area, decreased in its biodiversity. And so these ponds that used to be marsh are now being turned back into marsh. And so one good thing about having these ponds here opposed to other types of development is that we're able to do this now. We're able to turn these ponds back into marsh. And another good thing about them is if we look at this pond right here, that's white, you can kind of see there's some squiggly lines in there. And those are the historic channels of the marsh. And so this also helps aid in the restoration project, because when we breach the levee, like we can see in this photo down here, we open up the levee, open it up to become tidal, that water will flow naturally through those historic existing channels. And so that helps aid in the restoration process. And so this project has a goal to restore just over 15,000 acres back into marsh. And I told you earlier that Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge is just over 30,000 acres. And so we have 10,000 acres that is part of this restoration project. So about a third of the refuge is going through this restoration process right now. That's a great number. And then in conjunction with this is the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Project. And so this project is working to reconstruct some of these levees, because these levees were created for the salt ponds for salt production, but we've been using them to protect our communities from flooding, which was not their intended purpose. And then in conjunction with sea level rise, we need to build levees that are taller, wider, and are stronger, that are built for that purpose of protecting our communities. So the Shoreline Project is replacing, there's a few different phases. Right now they're in the process of replacing about 5 miles of levee near the education center in El Viso. And so they're going to do that, and then that will help them to be able to restore some of these ponds, so that we ensure that the communities are protected and safe before we open up these ponds to become tidal. Right, and then, so what can we do to help protect the wetlands or the salt marshes of the San Francisco Bay? Because there are a lot of influences. Kathleen talked about some of the historical influences with the gold rush, but we still have a lot of unnatural things that are traveling down our watersheds and into the bay. And so, like I mentioned before, my program is all about preventing urban runoff pollution. But what is urban runoff pollution? So anything that travels into our watersheds that is not water, pretty much. So we have trash can travel into them, soap from washing your car on your driveway, pest control that you might use in your front or backyard, any sort of like pesticides that are used in agricultural areas, and then of course waste from our pets. And so there's so many things that we can do to help prevent this, because just because you aren't walking up to a storm drain and throwing trash into it doesn't mean that you might not be contributing to what's entering that storm drain. These storm drains have no filter on them, so anything that enters storm drains flows directly into the bay. And so, when you're, let's say you are walking downtown and there's a trash can that's full. We've all come across this, and maybe you put your cup, down next to the trash can and think, oh, it'll get picked up, when the trash gets picked up. But sometimes if there's, if there's wind that comes the next day or rain, it might take that trash with it and go down the storm drain. So we always recommend holding on to that and bringing it to the next trash can that's more available. You can also pick up litter. Of course, do so safely. If when you see it, usually I'll take a bag with me or something when I'm taking my dog on a walk. You could take your car to a car wash opposed to washing it in your driveway. So not only do you not have to wash it yourself, but you prevent soap from going into the storm drain. And then this is actually sort of a double whammy because most car washes will actually reuse and recycle their water. So you're also saving your water consumption. Choose less toxic pest control and household cleaners. You can find out information on that at any of our local stores. Pick up after your pets when you're on a walk or in your backyard. And then, of course, educate others. So after our program tonight, try to tell maybe 2 or 3 of your friends if you're talking on the phone or on Zoom about what you learned today. And then you can also get involved in volunteer opportunities. So we do habitat restoration and trash pickup, as well as education and outreach programs that you can get involved with. Of course, right now it's a little awkward time to talk about volunteer opportunities, but once we're back in action, then those will be available for all to participate in. Okay, and that is the end of my talk here. You will be receiving some links to some of the items that I talked about today for more information. And then, of course, here's my email too, and anyone is always welcome to contact me.